Welcome to our first plenary session. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers today on a topic that's kind of hard to imagine a more important topic right now in the world, which is what can we do with the social sciences to understand and deal with this COVID problem, and the reason we're not all in lovely Cambridge right now. The structure here is we'll have 15 minutes for Katie, and then she will have 15 minutes, and then we'll kind of have a very open discussion. So first speaker, I'd like to introduce Katie. She's a professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Thanks so much for being here. Katie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to present. So I am delighted to share some work with you that my team and I have done on nudging vaccination, and I'm going to share two mega studies. I'll explain what that means in a moment. But first, I just want to mention what some of you may have heard we were chatting about before the session started, and that was a public conversation. If you heard Heng Chen Dai present yesterday from UCLA's Anderson School, then you heard actually, we're sort of going back in time. You heard about some work that grew out of this, and I'm really excited to tell you about what led to that research that you heard about yesterday. So not last fall. I should back up even further. When this pandemic began in March of 2020, the team that I work with at the Behavior Change for Good initiative at the University of Pennsylvania already had been thinking we'd do some studies in the fall of 2020 related to nudging flu vaccination, which is an important social problem, even when there isn't a global pandemic. And when the pandemic hit and we recognized that a way out would likely be through vaccination, we realized we should really scale up our ambitions and try to test a wide range of strategies for encouraging flu vaccination in the fall of 2020 that we would design with the intention of making those strategies portable, meaning reusable to encourage COVID-19 vaccination. And we wanted to test many, many variants on what might be effective, so we'd have really good candidates that could then be passed forward to folks to try to use those candidates to encourage COVID vaccination. So that's kind of the backdrop. And now I'm going to tell you about the research we did with those goals. So first of all, you may not know this, but even though the flu vaccine has been recommended to Americans to all Americans for over a decade, prior to that, it was just recommended for those who were, at risk and higher age groups, younger age groups, and so on. But it's now recommended for everyone. Even so, only about half of Americans choose to get a flu vaccine each year. So this in and of itself is a problem. But it shows you there's some similarity in this context where it's a recommended approach to preventing a severe illness that can cause death and kills tens of thousands of people every year in this country. Many don't choose to get it. So we thought this was an important problem in itself, but it's also a nice microcosm, and there's parallels with COVID-19. So we felt this was a problem right for what we call a mega study. And a mega study is sort of a traditional research study, except with many, many, many more hypotheses being tested at once than we traditionally would test. So normally in a standard research project, right, we have one, maybe two hypotheses, and we run an A/B test or an ABC test. In a mega study, we actually pool sometimes dozens of hypotheses and launch a study that tests them all at once. Specifically, different research teams come together, they design their own regular studies, and they're all pooled into one giant test. So a mega study is a very large field experiment. It's sort of perfectly designed for a policy problem of this type. And it has a number of benefits over the traditional way we do research, including that it allows for comparability of results across studies, that it can be run as a tournament and draw different teams from many disciplines. So if an economist wants to publish their research in the Quarterly Journal of Economics and a psychologist wants to publish their research in psychological science, each could design a study that lives within the same mega study, and then they can publish their own research in their preferred journals, but at least there's sort of a conversation and that they're all part of this larger collaboration on the mega study. Of course, it has the benefit of accelerating the pace of scientific discovery relative to the usual one study at a time process. And so we thought it was perfect for this challenge. So I'm going to tell you actually about these two mega studies. The first one was done with Penn Medicine and Geisinger Health, two large local health systems in the Northeast. With millions of patients collectively. And we went out to a team of about 150 scientists and said, give us your best ideas for messaging we could use to encourage people to get a vaccine when they come into a regular doctor's visit. So these patients had a routine primary care appointment during the 2020-2021 flu season at one of these two hospital systems. In total, we ended up with 50,000 patients roughly in this population, roughly evenly distributed between the two systems and fairly representative of the US population in various ways. And their rate of flu shot uptake in the prior flu season was about the national average, roughly 47%. So our experimental design here is that we had patients randomly assigned to one of 20 different experimental conditions. 19 of those conditions were treatment conditions where those patients received messages from us via text in the 3 days leading up to their doctor's appointment, encouraging them to get a flu vaccine. And there was one control condition that didn't receive these text messages. Now, I should note that control condition still received reminder text to come in for their appointment, all the usual care and the usual encouragement to get a flu vaccine from their doctor's office via email and so on, that we just didn't layer our additional treatments on top of that usual care. And we had, in the end, about 2,000 people per condition. So the outcome we're measuring in this mega study is whether or not people received a flu shot at their appointment or in the 3 days leading up to the appointment once treatment had begun. And we can measure that because patients, when they come into the doctor's office, are asked, have you already gotten your flu vaccine? If they say yes, that's recorded, and the date of their vaccine is also recorded. So experimental condition determined which text messages encouraging vaccination people received in the 3 days leading up to their doctor's appointment. And they could receive multiple texts, and some of those texts could be interactive. And a total of 26 scientists from the team of 150 invited to design studies did design the 19 treatments that we used to test different hypotheses. And the many hypotheses tested, there's too many since there's 19 treatments for me to go over all of them in this 15-minute presentation, but to give you a flavor for the kinds of things people came up with, one team was interested in whether humor could be used to boost vaccination rates. What if I tell you a joke about the flu? You know, have you heard the one about the flu? Don't spread it around, and sort of give you an earbug. Now you're laughing, it puts you in a good mood. Maybe you're more likely to remember it. Another team looked at whether or not maybe encouraging people to dedicate their vaccine to a loved one could be effective. Maybe that makes it more appealing. We dedicate running a marathon to someone we care about, and we dedicate lots of things to other people. What about a flu vaccine? Perhaps if the motive is primarily altruistic, that would be a big deal. Another team thought it might be interesting to frame the vaccine as reserved for you, providing a sense of ownership. And that maybe the endowment effect and or a sense of exclusivity might make you more likely to get a shot with that language. So really a wide range of ideas. This is just to give you a sample. Okay, so straight to some data. What I'm showing you on the x-axis is just a regression estimated increase in the number of patients vaccinated in each different treatment condition that we tested. So it's a distribution of treatment conditions, 19 tested, and I'm showing you the baseline vaccination rate in this population, which is that 41.8% of people who were offered a vaccine by their doctor said yes if they hadn't already been vaccinated. So that's our population. So pretty good, decent vaccination rate, not as high as I would like, but decent. What I think, a couple things I want to highlight. First, if we pool all the treatments, we could say that they significantly, sending these text messages significantly increases vaccination pooled. The second thing, though, is that we have a winner. 33% of the treatments significantly increase vaccination. This survives various forms of multiple comparison, adjustment, and happy to talk about that more later. And the top performer is, of course, we're overestimating the treatment effect here by just giving you a point estimate because of the winner's curse, right? In a distribution, we expect that the real lift would probably be something like 6 to 7 percentage points if we adjust for that winner's curse. But we are seeing a significant boost, and the best performer is telling people simply that a vaccine has been reserved for you. So that's what we move forward and sort of recommend. And actually all 3 of the top performers use that language, and none of the rest of the treatments in this test did, which is pretty compelling. This is what the top performing vaccine message looked like. 72 hours before an appointment, you get a very standard text from your doctor's office reminding you you have an appointment and it's flu season and a vaccine is available. And then 24 hours before, you get a shorter message just saying it's reserved for you. Okay, so key findings here. 2 reminder messages encouraging people to ask for this shot and saying it's reserved for you, boosted vaccination at nearly zero marginal cost. And the interventions that perform best when we just sort of did an attribute analysis of this whole pool, framed reminders as things that were reserved. And also the worst performers tend to be things that people weren't expecting, that were a little unusual in terms of the kinds of communication you get from a doctor's office. Things like the joke, which I was so bullish about, were really didn't do well because it wasn't what people, I guess, were expecting. And other messages that were similarly incongruent as rated by outside raters tended to perform worse. Okay, so in my remaining 5.5 minutes, I'm going to tell you about a second mega study we did that was even larger, asking a similar question, but with a different population. And that is, can we use text messages to encourage people to come into a Walmart pharmacy and get a vaccine? And we were interested in these 2 populations because they're both places where we want to encourage vaccination, a doctor's office and a pharmacy, but it's a different decision when someone already has an appointment, is already seeing their doctor, and is offered a vaccine, than when they need to, get in their car, drive to a pharmacy, ask for a vaccine. So we wanted to see if you require different messages, and we tested different messages in this setting. So we partnered with Walmart pharmacies, and this population, unfortunately, for legal reasons, we could only contact people who had previously received a vaccine at Walmart. So it is a select subpopulation here, more select than in the other case, and who had agreed to receive SMS messages. That still left us with almost 700,000 people for this study, who were fairly, again, representative of the US population, though I should note that they're skewed a little older, and we don't have much racial information about this group. In this case, we did not test the exact same messages. We actually had a totally different competition to design messages here, though there was some overlap in the ideas tested. We thought people might have different ideas about what would be effective for encouraging vaccination in this context. So it was a totally new design tournament that resulted in 23 different experimental conditions. Here we have order of magnitude more people per experimental condition. The outcome was receiving a flu shot at Walmart by the end of 2020. And the condition people were assigned to determine what text messages nudging vaccination they received from Walmart on September 25th, which is about when marketing ramps up for flu shots, and for 3 days after that. So messages, some people got multiple messages and some people just got one. 24 scientists designed these 22 different treatments, and the control group here is a business as usual, where there's no text messaging about vaccination. And again, we tried a lot of different things. I'll just give you kind of a sampling. One team tested whether describing vaccination as a way to protect family and friends might boost uptake. Another highlighted social norms, and that there was a growing norm of vaccination in the United States, to see if that would be a useful way to encourage vaccination. Another asked people to consider all the places they could catch this disease, to see if that fear factor might matter. And a final group, I should say, looked at language saying a flu shot was waiting for you. We couldn't use reserve for you language here because Walmart was worried that that might convey a false promise in case they were out of stock somewhere, but they used waiting for you language instead. And interestingly, that was the top performing message at Walmart, and so was the second best performer. So again, this sort of ownership language, this default language, if you will, rose to the top. Another thing I can say here is every single treatment significantly outperformed the baseline. We have lower vaccination rates at baseline, but these text message reminders work. For sure. And there is significant heterogeneity, though, in the quality of how well they work. And that's, of course, important. So this is the top performer. It's just really simple. Again, messaging, you can get a vaccine, we'll text you again. And then remember, it's waiting for you at Walmart. Okay, 2 key takeaways from this. The 2 reminder messages encouraging people to get it. This wins here. So kind of convergent evidence for the power of this ownership language. And another thing that jumps out here that we didn't see previously is that multiple messages outperformed. So when we just did an overall attribute analysis, that was another important dimension that arrived. So nagging works, and using this ownership language works in the context of Walmart. And again, we do see, we have lots of power. We see significant heterogeneity in the performance of those messages, which I think means, it's not just that sending messages matters, but the design of them matters. And as I mentioned at the start, of course, the overall goal of this was to inform COVID-19 vaccination efforts, but we were starting in the fall before a COVID vaccine was available so that hopefully we could have a candidate best message to roll out when vaccines did become available. And it was very important then to test whether this ownership language really would extend to COVID-19 vaccination messaging. And very excited that Heng-Chen Dai, Sylvia Sicardo, and a team at UCLA medical systems sort of took the baton, took the language that we saw was so high potential, and they went out and tested it. We were not involved in this, just really big fans. And they found that using that ownership language was effective, that text message reminders were effective in the early stages of the COVID-19 vaccination rollout. So I also want to highlight that there was a follow-up study done by another team in Rhode Island in May and June, where they had far fewer people getting vaccinated. So something like 2% of their population responded and got vaccinated compared to something like 20 or 30% in this trial. But they did not see a benefit of this language by that point. So it may be that, it's very dependent on where you are in vaccinating a population and how open they are to getting a vaccine for these kinds of messages to work. I am certainly hopeful that they'll be used in booster messaging and in countries that aren't as far along. Okay, let me stop there. I'm excited for the conversation.
Great, thank you, Katie. That was fantastic. So we'll just have just a minute or two for clarifying questions. I saw one just was asking a question just about dealing with the multiple comparisons problem, and just kind of, I think, looking for kind of practical advice and how you thought about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I will say that I'm very lucky that we had some excellent statisticians on our team guiding us on that. So we used multiple different adjustments, Q values and BH values instead of simple P values, which deal with the multiple comparisons issue. And the key results that I'm highlighting survive that. And happy to talk more, but there's lots more detail in our papers, which are also both publicly posted on SSRN.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is going to be Mushfiq Mubarak from Yale Economics. And Mushfiq, very happy to have you here, and the floor is yours. And just to be clear, we're going to come back and we'll have a discussion among the speakers. So if you didn't get to ask your question, we'll have more time later.
John, thanks very much, and Dean, for inviting me. And my schedule was a little tight this time around because I'm in the middle of teaching 6 classes, and thank you to Carrie for accommodating various scheduling requests. I'm really happy to be here in this conversation. So I'm going to be talking about masks, and then given Katie's presentation, I'm going to try and retain some time to talk about vaccines in developing countries as well. So please let me know if my slides aren't advancing for you. So on the title slide, because we have lots of researchers involved, so Jason Abelak, who's a health economist at Yale, is my closest collaborator. But we'll be talking about both how to get people to wear masks, so more akin to the type of approach that Katie was taking in behavior change. So that's the work that I guess Yale economists led. But we'll also talk about whether mask wearing actually changes COVID-19 transmission. And that's work that researchers at Stanford Medical School led, lab by Steve Luby, who also works in Bangladesh for many years, that he was involved in. And then we'll talk a little bit about scaling. So the original research was Yale, Stanford, and Innovations for Poverty Action did a lot of the research implementation. But since then, we've moved towards sort of larger scale implementation as opposed to research. And so we picked up lots of partners in the process. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So BRAC in Bangladesh is a key partner. SEVA is a partner in India. LUMS, the Lahore University of Management Sciences in Pakistan. Okay, so why are we talking about masks? It turns out that in the developing world, which is going to be where I'm most interested in changing behavior, we still need time to get widespread vaccine distribution, but mostly because it's a vaccine access problem. We're still withholding vaccine from poorer countries, and also because we need to set up the infrastructure to distribute vaccines in remote rural areas. So that's why masks remain an important line of defense. And the questions I'll try and answer today is, what do we learn about how do we increase mask wearing? How do we get people to wear masks? And when we do get people to wear masks, does that reduce COVID transmission? And then I'll talk about scaling and partnering with governments and what strategies work to scale up some of the effective things that you see in the trials. All right, so I'll only have this one slide on methodology. So for the mask study, we had an unusually large trial. So it was a cluster randomized control trial. We collected data from almost 350,000 adults in rural Bangladesh. It's a cluster because, say, the village, an entire village, all households in a village, plus the mosque that serves a village, the market that serves a village, anybody coming into the mosque and the market, they're all part of the cluster. So that's going to be the treatment, and then there's going to be separate clusters, physically distant, right? That will act as control clusters. And so there are 600 such clusters that we do a trial on, and we collect like symptoms data from about 350,000. We also, given the large number of clusters, we could randomly assign cloth masks in certain areas and surgical masks in others. And the reason we needed such a large trial is because COVID was relatively rare at this time in rural Bangladesh. So to detect changes in a rare outcome, we needed a very large trial. So that also meant that since we needed that data for the second stage, for the first stage on how to get people to wear masks, we were massively overpowered. So that gave us an opportunity to try out many different strategies. So we ended up, I haven't quite counted, we ended up with something akin to about 16 to 20 arm trial. Right? And now from Katie, I just learned a new phrase to explain trials like that. Okay, so what I'm going to jump to is, even though we tried 16 to 20 different strategies, I'm going to jump to the subset of strategies that formed our core intervention that seemed most effective. So we did a little bit of iterative experimentation, piloting back and forth to try and arrive at a core set that seems to increase mask wearing. And you have to do them. And one of the other things we learned from the piloting is that you have to do all four jointly. So number one is door-to-door distribution of masks. So we went to every household in the village and left masks with them. That's the no cost. And we're going to use the acronym NORM, norm, and I'll explain why in a second. So no cost mask distribution. And at the time that we distribute masks, we provide information. So we made little videos with some material translated from the WHO, but also the prime minister of the country, the director of the Imam Training Academy, kind of a national religious leader, as well as, most importantly, the best cricket player we've produced, Shakib Al Hasan. They all recorded videos for us that we showed here. And then the third thing is that some mosques are particularly high-risk transmission environment because people literally stand shoulder to shoulder, especially on Fridays, and get together at mosques. And so we wanted to do a secondary distribution of mosques as people were coming in, but that also gave us an opportunity to work with the imam, the village imam, and explain to him and his team why this is important, why we'd like him to endorse mask wearing and implement this at the mosque, right? So this turned out to be important, not only with the mosque, but also working with other community leaders, say the school headmaster, or if there's a union parishad chairman, like a locally elected leader who happens to live in the village, we definitely try to get their blessing, etc. Okay? So that's the role modeling by leaders. Okay? So actually, in that piloting and sort of iterative experimentation, we tried all three of these things jointly. We saw increases in mask wearing, but not sufficiently large increases that would make us feel comfortable that we'd be powered to detect changes in COVID transmission. So then we added this fourth component that turned out to be really critical, which is what we call reinforcement. And the idea that you can't just distribute masks and leave the village altogether, right? You actually have to go back. So we hire locally when possible. These guys, we'll call them mask promoters. And so their job is to spend a couple of hours in the main street, and then in the tea stall or the grocery store in the village. And if people are walking around without masks, like going up to them and politely intercepting and saying, look, we distributed masks in every household in this village. We know you got one. Why don't you please put yours on? Or if you forgot it, could you go back home and get it? Or if that's inconvenient, then here's a replacement mask that you can have, but please don't forget it next time because we don't have too many of these, right? And this kind of awkward conversation seems to have made a big difference in that it kind of tripled our effect sizes. And okay, so overall, what was the effect? So in the control villages, proper mask wearing, covering nose and mouth, was at 13%, and that jumped to 42%. So it's about a tripling of mask usage. And the important thing was that the impact was sustained over 10 weeks and then even further. So this is what the data looked like on mask wearing. This is, say, the day that the masks are distributed. And then we continue tracking, and it's not that there's a novelty factor and then it quickly dissipates. So, and importantly, these last 2 data points are after all intervention activities end. So we kind of leave the village, but we continue tracking. There was a separate team, plainclothes people, who are using smartphones to just like track what's happening with mask wearing and social distancing, etc. And one other important issue that came up from the WHO is that they were always worried why they weren't so vociferous about like supporting masks, is that they were worried that, oh, we don't have great evidence on it from our CTs, but like what if people get a false sense of security and they stop doing other things like social distancing? So we tracked that carefully. And it turns out it's the opposite, which is once you do mass promotion, it increases physical distancing, not decrease it. So people seem to take everything more seriously. All right. And then just a quick summary of, there's a lot of other things that we tried. So similar to Katie's approach, we scoured the literature in economics, psychology, marketing, etc., on what are the strategies that have proven to be successful in other places, right? So for example, some in the psychology literature told us that if you get people to make verbal commitments, they're more likely to follow through. So we tried that. It didn't really produce an effect in our case. Offering opportunities to signal to others. There was like vaccine trials in Sierra Leone that suggested that might have been important. It didn't prove to be useful here. Text message reminders in our case didn't prove to be useful, and that may speak to the sort of a question of external validity. So it turns out in Bangladesh, people are quite saturated by getting unsolicited text messages from a variety of like providers, and they may just choose to ignore them, right? But it is very cheap to do. So this is not to say that just because it didn't work in rural Bangladesh where people are saturated, that we shouldn't be trying it elsewhere, given that it's very cheap, right? And then from the economics literature, we've seen lots of evidence on incentives. Like for example, in sanitation, in the Indian government provides not monetary, but like social rewards in the sense of like this, describing a village as giving them a certificate that says this is an open defecation-free village to get proper sanitation encouraged. So we tried things like that. It didn't do much for us. All right, so bottom line results. So the first stage is mask usage went up by about 29 percentage points. And that is the intent to treat, right? That produces these intent to treat effects, which is reporting of COVID symptoms goes down by about 11.5%. And then once, so how did we do the second stage? Once people report positive COVID symptoms, these are WHO-defined symptoms, then we prioritize them for blood collection. And then we do a seroprevalence survey, and we see a 9.5% reduction in symptomatic seropositivity. So we're only tracking symptomatic COVID cases here. We're not saying anything about asymptomatic COVID. And then we see important heterogeneity. So that's the overall effect across surgical and cloth masks, but we see some important heterogeneity, which is that surgical masks give us much clearer evidence of COVID transmission. And the bottom line is that for people who are elderly, there's a 35% reduction in symptomatic seropositivity in the surgical mask villages. And this accords with the engineering data as well. We first, before launching the trial, we designed the mask, both cloth as well as surgical at Stanford. And we, with the cloth masks were higher quality than what you get in the US market, like triple layer interwoven fabric. Surgical masks also, good surgical masks, but locally produced and very cheap. So it costs now at scale when we're ordering, it costs us less than 5 cents. And we're seeing that, initially we saw, so these surgical masks start out at, say, 95% or 97% filtration efficiency. And whereas a good cloth mask starts out at about 40%, right? And the epidemiological data also suggests that these masks work better. But importantly, given environmental concerns, we were worried about people viewing these as one-time use. So we also did laboratory testing, wearing, washing, and then redoing the efficiency tests. Filtration efficiency test. We did up to 20 washes with the type of soap that people would use in rural South Asia. And even after 20 washes, they retain about 80% filtration efficiency, right? So the engineering data and the epi data say similar things. So since then, even before we publicized these results, the second stage results, when the crisis hit India back in April, we immediately went into sort of from research to kind of implementation and partnership mode to try and reach 100 million people. That was the goal we set in April. And that has actually now happened, and we're continuing the work. So most of the work has been happening in South Asia. And then in other countries where we work with governments, we collected data, and then we realized, for example, in Uruguay, that encouraging mass wearing is actually not necessary given the current rates of mass wearing plus vaccination rates, right? So in these 4 countries, I'll just point out some of the biggest gains. One was in Bangladesh, where the government gave us, along with BRAC, a very large NGO in the world, the largest NGO in the world, the responsibility of like running exactly this program in about half the country to reach about 80 million people. Okay? So BRAC has been doing like a tremendous job. So they take like I was trying to say, our trial size of 350,000 is impressive, but BRAC is actually reaching like half the population of the country. And in Pakistan, we started working with the government. So especially the government of the city of Lahore was proved to be a key partner. Now, the nice thing is that every time we do another kind of replication, we learn, there's new innovations that come up. So for example, this is a city, not a rural area. And of course, mass promotion and the change, how you change social norms is going to be very different in a city than in a village. Right? So we're learning in the process. And the way we reached out to governments was basically we hired somebody on our team who had worked in the Gujarat state government for many years. And so his name is Gautam Patel, and he was very helpful in helping us think through, like, how do we present all this information that we have to government such that it can be actionable, right? So you basically take the government's decision-making process, we put all of our materials, like including where to order masks, how to test for efficiency, etc., and you organize it in a way that a particular bureaucrat who needs to make that decision, right, and we made it like publicly available and interactive this way. Okay. And then the final thing I'll say on scale up is that, when we went to Lahore, so here's some of the innovations we learned, right? Like, now you're in a city, right? So going door to door is of course expensive. So this is actually an envelope up here, right? So we partnered with the governments, and this is the health minister for the state of Punjab in Pakistan. So this is her mailing the first envelope to the chief minister. So we put the mask and information in these envelopes and then use Pakistan Post to send it all out. And then we use like people's electricity bills to try and target like who are the people who are most likely to need masks. So now one thing that we learned is that like providing the support to the government actually then opens up a lot of other opportunities. The government, we built some credibility with this government. I had not worked in Pakistan before this, right? But that now led us to now working on vaccination. So I'll just stop in a minute, just talking about what's happening with vaccinations. Now, in developing countries, the issue is a little bit different than the type of context that Katie is studying. Okay, the issue is, first of all, people aren't getting vaccination rates are very low. Okay, so the first thought might be, maybe there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy there. So we did that study. So this is this I'm reporting from a paper we published in Nature Medicine, which is I collected data along with many collaborators across the world in like standardized data in 15 different countries on vaccine hesitancy, the same question. So we had 13 countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America that are low and middle income. And then we had US and Russia as comparison points, right? And what you find is every single LMIC, in our 13 LMICs, vaccine hesitancy is lower, significantly lower than it is in the United States, and much, much lower than it is in Russia, right? So the excuse that, say, Bourla, the Pfizer CEO, is using, where he just makes this claim recently that, if we were to send it to Africa, there's too much hesitancy, it wouldn't work, right? It's just bullshit. People are actually much more eager, and these countries have a much more robust history of like childhood immunizations, etc. Okay, so it's not about vaccine hesitancy. It is, of course, a lot about supply. Developing countries aren't getting the supply, so they've signed contracts, they've paid, but then at one point, India, forced an export ban on Serum Institute, which has been the biggest supplier, one of the biggest suppliers of vaccines. They also claim that the U.S. is not supplying the proper raw materials. Pfizer, Moderna, especially, has decided not to engage in the developing world at all. In fact, when they negotiate prices, they've been giving developing countries higher prices, not lower prices. Okay? But then, in these data, we also learned some things that are very, very simple, and like Katie's use of the word congruent, right? reminded me that it turns out people who are hesitant, they're worried about very standard things. It's not like some weird conspiracy theory about Bill Gates injecting something. It's just like they're worried about what the side effects might be, whether they're going to miss work, etc. And healthcare workers or the community health workers are the most trusted source of information. Okay, so that's the supply problem and the hesitancy problem. Now, it turns out where there is a problem is that it's not that there are many people who are deeply distrustful, is that there's a lot of people who would take the vaccine if it was easy to do so. Right, the people I'm calling indifferent. Okay, but the problem is now I'm working in, so this work is now being done in Lahore, but also in rural Sierra Leone and in rural Bihar in India. So it turns out in Sierra Leone, if you want to take a vaccine, right, there are vaccines available in like some towns around the country where there is cold storage. But for take a representative rural person, it would take them an entire day to get the vaccine. Okay? And even like, and the travel cost might be almost an entire day, which means that you'll probably have to stay overnight. Okay, like you probably wouldn't get an appointment or a vaccine the exact same day, right? So we need to actually, the types of interventions that we are trying out that we need to do is actually really sort of simple, obvious ones. There's no clever social science like innovation here, which is that let's just get vaccines to people. And so in Sierra Leone, we're doing it like the idea is to like send motorbikes with a nurse out to remote rural areas. In Bihar, we're doing it, and in Pakistan, in Bihar, it's about mobile vaccination clinics, like vans being sent out to rural areas. And in Pakistan, it's like in Lahore, which is an urban area, setting up temporary vaccination centers in various neighborhoods. Okay, and then layering on top of that a few different interventions on social mobilization and messaging to get people to the vaccination centers and to their appointments. Okay, so let me stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Great, thank you so much. So I think what I probably want to do is first let our speakers ask questions of each other, since there are a lot of touch points between the two talks. Katie, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Yeah. No, I have lots of questions. I think my first question is around the sort of in-person social pressure approach and what you think about using that kind of an approach for encouraging vaccination and potentially doing it in the US. I've been thinking a lot about, we saw small effect sizes in our study, and then there were some effects in COVID, but they probably declined over time. And thinking about sort of how to get to the remaining folks, it seems like an in-person approach might work better. I'm wondering, what your thoughts are on that, and specifically, like if you were porting your insights to the US, which I realize isn't the context where you've done this work, like what you think would be most valuable?
Okay, that's a really excellent question. So we start with the caveat that I don't really understand the United States, even though I live here. But like, okay, a couple of this might come out in a disorganized way, but a couple of quick thoughts off the top of my head. So one is that this idea of either wearing masks or getting vaccines they've become weirdly political in the US in a way that's really unusual, right? So in that they're not, in the context that we're doing our work, there is no political statement in wearing a mask, right? So it's not affiliated with your identity in some way, whether it's political or social, right? So I think, so that also suggests that maybe social norms will matter, meaning that like when it's affiliated with your identity, that means that whether I take an action is also dependent on what people whose opinions I respect, whose views I care about are also doing, right? So we're going to need not individual level, but like community level strategies to change behavior, which is what we did in Bangladesh, but for a very different reason. Okay, and then the second thing I'll point out is that now to talk about vaccines, the in-person approaches. Yes, so we are in a place where I think the like low-hanging fruit have been picked, right? And that was exactly the right place to start. Like, let's do really low cost, and as you said, zero marginal cost things to try and get the percentages up a little bit, which is great. Now, once the low-hanging fruit is, now we are going after a much more difficult population. Okay? So now I would say, okay, let me actually give you a non-answer, which is I would say ethically, right? Rather than trying to convince the last 20, 30% of Americans to get vaccinated. If those resources can be reallocated to places where people actually want the vaccine, then we would do much more in terms of attaining global herd immunity, which we need, right? So in fact, so there is a paper published in PNAS, I think, that did modeling, like looking at, okay, given trade connections between the US and other countries, right? And the possibility of re-importation of the virus or new variants of the virus, right? The US, even if it's behaving completely selfishly, right? Let's say we have an objective function where we care zero about the rest of the world. Even if you're completely selfish, it might be more efficient for us to give some of the vaccines, provide the resources to other countries where the virus may otherwise mutate, rather than vaccinating our own populations. Sorry, that was a non-answer, but I think it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, no, that was a helpful, thoughtful answer. I just as you know very little, it sounds like, or you feel like you know very little. I'm sure you know much more than you admit about the U.S. population. That's how I feel when I think about developing context. So it's really interesting to have this exchange of ideas.
Yeah. So Katie, can I on this? Can I ask you? So like thinking about feasibility and practical feasibility, right? So you know, in Bangladesh, I have a much clearer idea. Okay, like I can actually think through. Oh, you know what? If you were to propose an intervention, I could give you a pretty clear idea. Yeah, that's going to be feasible for us to do, or not, right? So just like without thinking through like the social science very carefully, like, you know, if you wanted to do in-person things in the US, what are the types of things you think are actually feasible? Like, could you actually go door to door, knock on people's door? Or would you want to like go to clinics and set up shop in schools and clinics? Like, is it feasible for us to maybe go and like what some things that we do in developing countries sometimes is to go and encourage children and have them act as ambassadors, right? To their parents. Like, what are the like categories of things you think that like we'd get away with without getting sued?
Well, I'm probably the wrong person to ask for legal expertise, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot. It's a really interesting question because even before hearing your talk, probably influenced by having read your paper, I've been thinking a lot about the next frontier in the US. And I do think, you know, we have to step it up to things like in person. By the way, I'm completely on board with sending lots of vaccines overseas. I just want to do it all. It doesn't seem like it has to be an either or. It seems like partnering with massive health systems to do some of this outreach, not just virtually, but in other ways, makes a lot of sense. One step might be not just text messages, but trying to schedule phone conversations, which can be very low cost, or Zoom calls with a provider to talk to people about the decision. I think, you know, there's lots of research even dating back to, you know, classic social psych experiments on compliance by Milgram, looking at, which is a weird thing to invoke in a situation where we certainly want to make ethical decisions, but we do know that people respond differently to, depending on the degree of social distance, right? So if a text message is little, you know, as far from someone as possible, and in person is as close, a phone call is somewhere in between in terms of the connection you can make and the empathy you can build and the persuasion you can affect. So it seems like we might shift to phone calls. That is very feasible, I think, to do in the US, or maybe Zoom conversations. It would be great to do massive door-to-door trials. I think the challenge will be, and I will just say, you know, we did this big project with the city of Philadelphia to try to encourage vaccination through a lottery. And in the experience of doing that, I learned a lot about how hard it can be to contact individuals. We would draw names of people who were winners from a database we had of Philadelphia residents, send a team to their door repeatedly to knock and try to reach people. And it was very hard to find people, right? They're at work, they have another commitment, you don't know. So I'm a little bit worried about the feasibility of door knocking, especially if we want to, you know, only look at the 20% of people who haven't gotten vaccinated yet, say, and target them and having reliable contact information. But I think it's worth a try. It's the kind of thing, you know, we should be investing in all these strategies and exploring. But to me, it seems like the first thing to do would be probably phone and Zoom and try to schedule that through health systems.
So let me pick up on one phrase that came up in Katie's comments and like just talk about other research on behavior change that we've seen have been successful in developing countries. And that is about social network-based strategies that people are often much more persuaded by or care about the advice and opinions of people they know, as opposed to even experts, right? Katie and I calling someone in, whether it's Kansas or Alabama, about like the importance of vaccines may not have the same effect as if their neighbor were to have that conversation. And in a setting, like maybe have that conversation in a setting where it doesn't sound like you're being told to do something, right? And so in agriculture, and so we've been using these types of strategies in economics for a while, especially in development economics. And some of the like important authors in this area are Laurie Beeman, who's at Northwestern, Arun Chandrasekhar, who's at Stanford, and Emily Breza, who's at Harvard. And so I'll start with like some work in agriculture that I did. Like I think it'll take me maybe a minute or two to explain. So basically, you want to convince farmers to adopt some new agricultural technology, but it may be risky because like they've been doing like some other method for many, many generations, right? And now you're suddenly saying, look, this new technique, like we tried it in Zambia and it really worked well, it doubled productivity, and why don't you try it here in Malawi, okay? And the people's reaction is risky because they're like, oh, it might have worked somewhere else, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for me, right? If it worked under controlled conditions, like my soil conditions are different, or my rainfall conditions might be different, etc. Right? So at that point, it turns out that like people are much more likely to learn from the behavior of farmers around them, and that's how the Green Revolution diffused across South Asia, and which is massive for us. It like doubled or tripled agricultural productivity, and fundamentally changed food insecurity in my country, in Bangladesh. Right? So then, so now how do you, like, given that people learn from their neighbors, how do you kind of activate that, right? So then the question that come up is that, okay, who do you want to choose as seed farmers, right? And second, how do you incentivize them? Like, what incentives do they have to actually spend the time and effort to communicate with others, right? And even this question of like, who do you want to choose as seed farmers? You might say, like, our immediate reaction might be, oh yeah, you want to choose somebody who's socially central, right? So that may be correct because they have lots of connections, right? But it also is the case that people who are socially central are often atypical, right? Because they are central, they have the, they're richer, etc., right? And so if a technology or technique works for a richer person, it may not be relevant for me, right? And so then the experiments that we ran was like in one set of villages, used lead farmers, right? Socially central type people. In another set of villages, what we call peer farmers, like actually picking out average looking people spread throughout the village, right? And then it turns out that the peer farmers, they're actually better at disseminating technologies, right? In the case of sanitation, we learned that like people actually look to the behavior of people who are poorer than them because it's a shame factor. If somebody even who comes to work in my house is using a toilet, it's really shameful for my wife or my husband to have to go out and deal with it, right? So it's not socially central people, it's actually exactly the opposite that seems to work there, right? So we might want to think about, in the case of vaccines, are there creative ways for us to mobilize average, people in Alabama to talk to their neighbors, if that's a place. I don't know what the Alabama vaccination rate is, but if that's a place that vaccinations are needed.
It's a good guess that vaccinations are needed. I think that's really interesting. You also said something about schools, and I wanted to ask you for a little bit more on that. And I actually don't know about the evidence from developing countries or the US on seeding school children and sort of educating them and then asking them to speak with their family members. I also haven't thought a lot about the ethics of that, but it's certainly one, when we think about what are the different ways that we can reach a large community, health systems are one, but schools are another. I'm curious what evidence comes to mind there.
Yeah, I'll talk about it, but there's a chat thing where somebody wants your
yes, I have lots of sunlight.
Here
we go.
It's a sunny day in the Northeast.
Thank you.
Yeah, so on schools, so I don't know of really rigorous evidence like randomized control trial based evidence, but let me tell you about what I have heard in the sanitation sector, right? So there's one of the big innovations in sanitation of the last 20 years has been something called community-led total sanitation, okay? Which is the idea that, okay, what you do is you actually, okay, this is a good example of how to get like a community level intervention started as opposed to individual level or door-to-door interventions, okay? So in villages, it started in Bangladesh. We actually innovate a lot and export, which is great in the development space. So, but it's like big, much bigger now in India, which is you go into a village, right? You get everybody together And then you help them understand through demonstration that like each person's behavior affects everybody else, right? And the way you do it is that you go in and you map the whole village, okay? So you like get everybody together, like let's draw a map of where everybody lives. And then once you map the whole village, you ask people to point out, okay, who has latrine? And then you see many houses, very few latrines, right? And then you ask the people, oh, like those of you who don't have latrines, can you mark where you go? Okay, and like you put in like say yellow chalk to mark that. And then pretty soon the entire map starts looking very yellow, right? So that kind of, and you do it this way because it's not polite to go in and start talking about feces, right? You have to introduce in a step-by-step process. And then once you has that has a visual effect, and then you say, look, there's a lot of this stuff around, and let's demonstrate how this might actually come back into our food systems and stuff. Yeah? So once you do that, then you actually have like simultaneously, and I've seen this in Western India and Maharashtra, so you have people then going out to the schools, right, and convincing the children, and you have the children then act as ambassadors, like basically harass their parents that this is really important, this is important for my health, why aren't you investing in another tree, right? So there's a claim that works. It's just that like when I say that I don't have rigorous evidence, like this is of course it's a package intervention with multiple things going on. And it's hard for me to tell like how important the school thing is, but it is a part of like through experiment, like I guess field experimentation, but I'm not using the word experimentation as like RCT. Like they've decided that this is important.
Well, it's really interesting because I think at least when I think about what your findings, what you just described there, what we found, it's clear that just, persistent messaging, communication through as many channels as possible, is valuable and maybe something we underappreciate. At least in my field, I feel like there's an emphasis on sort of finding the magic wording or finding the magic formula. And I wonder if we should instead be focused more on just exerting influence through as many different in-person tactics as possible. So the message is coming from all sides, right? Which is really what you're saying. Reinforced by as many messengers as we can find, and maybe worry less about the exact wording and more about that consistent reinforcement.
Yeah, but there are benefits and costs. I mean, of course, these are expensive, whereas like if you can get even a 3, 4, 5 percentage point increase via text messages, like you should always layer that on top as well, right? But in some cases, I guess like in development, I guess you get what you pay for, right? So
it's reminding me of the paper by actually, I guess, MIT's Erez Yoeli and collaborators on encouraging tuberculosis treatment encouraging patients with tuberculosis to take their medications regularly, to follow their treatment regimen, that basically just showed sort of really nagging. And I think it was done through digital means, right? Both like a text message, if you don't respond and say you've taken it today, then I think you get a follow-up call and so on, was really effective. So anyway, as the mother of a 5-year-old, I feel a little bit funny but saying this, but it does seem like sort of really nagging is something we're seeing consistently is effective as a tool for improving public health.
At least in the US, I think we seem to be starting to move past the nagging phase though, right? Like there's sort of this, now we're moving towards compulsion. Like you can't fly, you can't come into a restaurant. And I think it's kind of interesting. Do we think of that as an unfortunate backstop? Do we think that this was like the right sequencing of how we should have done it? I don't know. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Actually, I think that's, it's not the right sequence. I think we should have started with that. So, just I'll share an anecdote. So, I work on sanitation, trying to get people to use toilets, and I do a lot of bribing of different kinds, subsidies for toilet construction and all sorts of incentives, etc. Right? And then Ed Glazer, this urban economist at Harvard, but kind of a Renaissance man. He reads a lot and he thinks about various countries around the world, including the U.S. and history. And he's like, that sounds insane when he's talking to that, right? What you do is like, if people are defecating in the open, you just like put them in jail, right? That's how you, like you pass a law. I mean, put them in jail is like, I'm exaggerating, but like you pass a law that makes that behavior illegal because that's a public health threat, right? And that's how you solve problems. And there is something to that. Like if you have strong enough institutions, right, to support and enforce mandates, right, then I think that is, and we have a clear enough evidence that, look, there are externalities here. I think that's the right way to go.
also just kind of curious in like the U.S. context where it's become this kind of part of your political identity. I imagine there's a fair number of people who would at this point almost like to be coerced, right? Like they don't want to kind of cross that line and kind of align with the other side. So saying, well, if you don't do this, you'll lose your job.
That's a great point. Great point. Yeah.
Actually, we had some nice comments. I think that maybe Sid Suri asked a great question. Sid, are you in the chat? You can ask it live, or I can paraphrase for you.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, great. Yeah. Thank you.
First of all, thanks for the excellent and inspiring presentations today. Thank you so much. So my question is very simple. Executing field experiments is notoriously hard. Executing field experiments at the massive scale that you guys have done is even harder. So what are some of the important lessons you guys learned about how to pull off these mega studies? And these kind of practices often don't make it into the papers. That's why I'm asking you now.
I could start because I think what we did was far easier, actually. so I bet there will be better lessons, and I'll let you think for a moment. I think honestly, one of the biggest lessons I learned was that this was it's always hard to do trials like this, but this was an amazing moment when barriers fell down faster than I've ever encountered when we went to organizational leaders, governments, and proposed things. Normally the kinds of studies that were done by the teams that I worked with over the last year and a half, I mean, they would have been absolutely no's. And instead, CEOs stepped in and said, absolutely yes. The mayor of Philadelphia got involved in, people who I would never expect to be interested in academic research, shoved barriers aside. And what I guess I'm wondering is, how do we carry forward that incredible support that we gained for the scientific process and for learning about these important issues? It may be impossible, but is there any way to harness the support we received at this time and make sure it carries forward? Because this isn't the last crisis that we will face, and it's not over. And so what I'm most worried about is, how can we use that kind of support and make it possible to do this kind of work again? It's not exactly a lesson learned, it's a question I'm wondering about.
Just to add to that, so Katie's experience was exactly the same as mine in countries where we were working. So I started early in the pandemic working in Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sierra Leone. And Bangladesh, I have a lot of experience over working for 15 years. And the amount of access and openness from government was just unprecedented. And I'm really hoping, like Katie, that just carries forward. I think we have turned a corner now, where people, we've been able to establish some credibility and some trust. And I think this will pay off in the long run. But Sid, that's a really excellent question. And I think the main thing I want to convey here is that, look, while John and Dean and Sinan, they invited me to present, I'm just here representing an extremely large team, and the quality of that interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary team is what's critical. And when I say interdisciplinary, I don't only mean having people from Stanford Med School and from Yale Economics. I also mean that, if the study is impressive, then it's impressive because of its implementation, right? And people sitting at Yale and Stanford are not responsible for that, right? We can design things, we can push things, we can lead things, but ultimately it has to be done in the field. And there are literally, the reason why I didn't have a set of names is that there are literally hundreds of Bangladeshis who made this happen at that scale. And so you have to have, I guess, to make it right, and we had to do it very quickly, obviously, because COVID was, the virus is fast, right? And so there, I would say that, look, to be able to react fast, you have to make the investments, those 10, 15 years in advance to set up the infrastructure so that you can mobilize these teams very, very quickly. So that doesn't happen at the drop of a hat. You have to have, say, rosters of people who can go out and do this work and collect this data, and you have to keep, so you have to keep them employed, right? So there's a lot of sort of economies of scale here. And then the other thing that's been important for us that I had underappreciated is the importance of communication, right? of various forms. So the reason is that these, so if you're calling it like an impressive scale, it's partly because it's expensive, right? It's hard to do because it's expensive. Now, then in the middle of COVID, I have to convince someone that, look, you should invest in this, right? So I have to communicate clearly with them, right? But also you should invest in this because we are going to be able to communicate this clearly with policymakers. So you'll see a return on your investment, right? This is not just like my idle research curiosity, right? This is going to turn into actual impact. So it wasn't research funding we got, we really got like effective algorithm funding, right? And so then they're like, okay, then let's think through how you're going to have that impact. I can only invest in this if I feel confident that this is going to change someone's life, right? And for that, that's why the implementation and scaling up was so important. And we're like, yeah, okay, here are the things that we'll use. And we actually got money separately to have a big communications team that was separate from the research team.
I echo both of those points. They're both true in our case too. Huge teams, lots of infrastructure in place in advance, and being able to communicate and having credibility in that were really important to us obtaining funding as well. So really, really great points.
Katie, I would ask one question. I mean, one thought was really neat about the mega study idea is, you kind of have a horse race among a whole bunch of ideas. Each one kind of, presumably there's some latent theory of why. It seems like the next step obviously would be like, why is this one so effective, right? Like it kind of really kicks off research. I think it's an interesting model of like, let's try a whole bunch of things as kind of a, let me direct you to what is probably research that's worth doing.
I love that. And one of the things that was so fantastic in this particular case is that dream came to fruition in that we ended up with these sort of clear winners and the reserve for you, waiting for you language. We had kind of an idea of why, but it was just a bit vague, and the field isn't the right place to test that. And a doctoral student at UCLA, John Bogard, took the inspiration from this work and ran a series of both lab and field experiments in other settings, trying to understand the mechanism responsible for the benefits of this sort of ownership language, the reserve for you language. And what he was able to pinpoint in that work is that it seems to be primarily about a sense of exclusivity, not just the ownership, but the feeling that this is an opportunity that's exclusive to you and you don't want to let that go to waste. So it was really exciting to see this develop. I've never watched science move quite so fast and efficiently between, like I said, like the CEO of Walmart getting involved, pushing down barriers, them working with us. And then, we have a finding in December, we can see what the best performer is. Heng Chen and her team run to UCLA, deploy it there, then Rhode Island's testing it after that. And then we've got this doctoral student figuring out the mechanism. And it's like baton handoffs, right? It's all different teams. And it renewed my faith in what we can do as a scientific community. And it was really exciting to watch.
Great. Well, I think that's a great point to conclude. So we're at time. I wanted to thank both of our speakers for just both fascinating presentations and discussions. And we're all the organizers and everyone in the audience is extremely appreciative of what you gave us today.